And I know you're moving on in terms of not being the chair in future years, but what do you see as the future for the Mercury Prize?
It's a good question. I think one of the complicated things about the Mercury Prize, it's quite expensive to produce, and it needs the collaboration of quite a different number of people, which includes obviously record companies entering things and supporting it, artists being willing to play the shows and so on. Historically, it's always only been able to work because it's had sponsors and they're harder to get. It's now effectively sponsored by the BPI, which is the record industry itself, which they didn't want to do at the beginning because they wanted it to be seen more independent. But I think the big problem is and for many years we've been told that albums are dead and no one's interested in them. So I think we're surprised we got this far, because 10 years ago people would have said Prize is looking to a different way of working, but in fact you get more albums entered every year. That doesn't seem to be the issue. People do make albums. I think the thing I can't predict is really, actually, funnily enough, is to do with television. Because of the way the business works and sponsorship and so on, in a sense, everybody's prepared to put some money in because they think they're going to get the publicity that comes from having a TV show. And if without a TV show, they would be less willing to do it. But TV is not very supportive of music. Partly because they don't have the money and they see it's expensive, and they're historically used to record companies paying for music television, and partly because they have a different sense of audience. So it's quite difficult to persuade a TV company that there were viewers who would watch 10 bands all playing different sorts of music. And that for them is a big problem, because it's easier on something like Radio 6, which has always been very supportive because they have a bigger range of music. They're very hard for TV people. So every year it's a kind of struggle to get a TV show, and it partly accounts for the odd ways in which the price changes, times of year and format and so on. So this year, I think if the TV, this year there's an hour's live TV on BBC, which we haven't had for a long while. If that works and actually gets a decent audience, then I think that will probably mean that it kind of will be established. If it doesn't, then I think there's going to be, I'm sure it'll survive, but I think there'll be some rethinking about whether it should be on such a big scale and so on. So I'm coming off partly because I thought 25 years, I'm about the same age as David Bowie. I think this is sort of time to to round it off, and other people should take on the role. But I also think we're living in quite, it's going to be quite, I think the music industry has survived the first state of crisis, but I still think there are problems to come which Mercury will reflect one way or another.
Simon, you're involved in another project called the Live Music Exchange.
Mm.
What is the Live Music Exchange?
Well, this came out of, we got, as an academic, I'd always been interested in live music. When I was a critic, I always loved going to live shows. I was going to 3 or 4 gigs a week. And I always thought music made the most sense live and not on record. But in the academic study of popular music, it's always been treated entirely as kind of about records, and people looking at charts and hits and all that stuff. So a colleague of mine, at Glasgow University, and myself, had always been concerned that this was really to misunderstand how music worked in Britain, was to focus so much on records, and we should focus on live music, because that had a very interesting story and tells you lots of things. So we got money, we got a big research grant to have a project on history of live music, and which involved archive research, involved getting a PhD student and a full-time researcher and doing a lot of archive research, but also interviewing pretty well all surviving major promoters from the 50s and 60s and 70s and all through to now, just talking to promoters about what they did and how they did it. And when that project finished, we realised that we'd made a number of interesting contacts and a lot of people who were interested in thinking about this. So we decided, we got a bit of extra funding to set up what is essentially a kind of website where we have regular blogs on live music, but also we can archive and put down all sorts of anything that's happening in the news about what live music, what's happening, what the Live Nation's latest shenanigans are or whatever it might be. And then we also organise day seminars and things where you bring people from the music industry with researchers. So we had one, the most recent one we had was actually in Newcastle. We've had them in London, Cardiff, Glasgow, Edinburgh, and there are various other projects of people. For example, we've been working quite a lot with the Venues Trust, doing stuff on how you can protect independent venues from planning from what happens when you get new builds and noise complaints and planning and regulation, local authority regulations, trying to bring people together to talk about them and see how the problems can be solved. So it's a mixture of academic researchers and addressing kind of policy issues. So I found it really, really interesting.
Simon, we're here at Core Music in Hexham. Core Music's a music social enterprise. We put on about 200 music lessons a week, and we're involved with community events and that sort of thing. We're always trying to push music of all genres here and encourage people to take part at whatever level they want to do. How important do you think local music hubs like Core Music are to music in general, but also encouraging new performers?
Absolutely vital. I think they're the centre of how music works. One of the things I was most fascinated in reading about British music in the 1950s, about history, was it's still extraordinary to me that so many teenagers aged, roughly 14 to 17, were prepared to stand up on stage and play, even they hadn't clue, without any formal music education. Although when you look into it, there are interesting things about how they did get their education, which is where local music, youth clubs and so on come in. So I think it's always been absolutely vitally important that people have access to instruments and talking about music and getting the confidence to stand up and play. And that's particularly become problematic in the last 20 years with the whole, for lots of different reasons, partly economic, partly to do with educational ideology, the fact that it's increasingly difficult for most children to get decent access to music education. And I remember one year when I was doing an interview about who was on the Mercury shortlist, and the BBC person who interviewed me, who had done his research and was knowledgeable, one of his first questions was I worried that something like 85% of the people on the list had been to private schools? And I wasn't exactly worried because they're musicians. But on the other hand, he was raising a question that I think is a problematic question, that people need resources to get instruments, which are very expensive. They need resources and parents who are committed to finding them teachers and sometimes travelling great distances. We've got children who are having musical careers, and I know how much work goes into them. So I think what you need is to maximise resources outside the education system, which currently isn't doing a good job, for people who don't necessarily have either the money or the experience or the knowledge to know how to pursue a musical career. So I think something like Core is just wonderful, and I think that there are equivalents in other places, and for some music. I mean, if you look at the whole development of Black British musicians in the 80s, when I was living in Coventry, they all came out of kind of similar to Core schemes. They weren't coming out of schools or conservatories or universities. They were coming out of local music schemes aimed at the sort of music they were interested in, and so I think that they have been essential for British music.
Simon, thank you very much indeed for talking to Hexhamtv.
Thank you for having me.